individually. At this point, I want to turn it over to our moderator for tonight's conversation, Barry Thomas, who's the Director of Equity and Diversity at Omaha Public Schools, and is also an Inclusive Communities Lead Diversity Advocate alumni. Barry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to all of my wonderful friends at Inclusive Communities. And thank you all for joining us this evening as we engage in this conversation around a very important topic around reparations. I'll just start here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And most of us are fairly well aware that that's the preamble to what became the Declaration of Independence. And it's what we kind of say our country stands for and has stood by, and the principles that are supposed to guide us. But most of us also, I hope all of us are aware that that declaration didn't apply to all men, and that all people were not created equal in accordance with how society was set up at the establishment of this country. And we've been trying to fix our society to make it so over these last couple of centuries. And so our conversation really today is about continuing how to approach how we fix the preamble to make it true, to make that declaration actually applicable to all of the people within our country, within this nation. And so we are aware that there's been a purposeful disassociation from the beginning of the white male wealthy experience in this country, as opposed to everyone else that was pushed to the margins. And as we had analyzed that and see that it was purposeful, and I need to make sure I'm clear when I say this, it was purposeful, because even in that Declaration of Independence, there initially was an anti-slavery clause that was stricken out of that Declaration of Independence that would have actually spoken to the need to end and abolish enslavement of African peoples. And so again, I say intentionally and purposefully, it was taken out. And that purposeful disassociation of the white experience, the male experience, the wealthy experience, has been something that we've been trying to untangle for centuries within this country. And part of that conversation can be and should be centered around, how do we repair what was started as something that was so fissured, something that was so fractured, something that was so broken? How do we repair that? And if we go into the conversation of this evening around reparations, kind of thinking about it that way, I think it opens our minds to seeing that there are some things that we can and should do collectively to acknowledge what we had established as a foundation for this country, and how we can continue to try to repair upon a cracked foundation. And we start the conversation, a lot of people focus in around reparations, specifically looking at the African-American experience in this country. But I appreciate the fact that Inclusive Communities, and specifically in this case, Dominic, started our conversation this evening with a land acknowledgement. And that land acknowledgement specifically is supportive to the identity of our Native and Indigenous peoples, from whom this land was no one asked to come and move into these spaces. It was these are places that were sacred, that were taken from a group of individuals. And so I want to ask first Colette Yellow Robe, one of our panelists. I want to start our conversation around reparations, thinking about land acknowledgements, and how land acknowledgements in themselves can start to moving us forward when it comes to reparations. So Colette, I'll ask you first. Why is it important that we begin our meeting today with a land acknowledgement?
Hello. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. And your beautiful preamble was a great way to get our brains going. I feel very revved up right now. So, well, first of all, yes, thank you, Dominic, for doing the land acknowledgement for us tonight, and for checking with me. That was very, very kind of you as you wrote that document for tonight. It's important to start with the land acknowledgement of our indigenous tribal nations and who became Native Americans in this side of the world, and what we call Turtle Island in North and South America. because it acknowledges at last the whole prehistory that is often erased in our textbooks or in our everyday lingo or a concept. And that would be taking things back to 1491, before Columbus would have, in his opinion, discovered Hispaniola in the Caribbean areas. That's why it's important. When Columbus came over, they automatically advanced an agenda of conquering the land. And by virtue of that, they were conquering the bodies as well of the indigenous women. In particular, we were subjugated and considered less than automatically, if you can believe that, and then automatically putting us into bondage in terms of being oppressed by our indigenous men and also by the European colonizers that were coming in. That's why it's important, because that sentiment of conquering the land advanced all through American history. And to today, we still suffer the contemporary consequences of that atrocious history. As you know, many of you know that we failed to get rid of Columbus Day in Nebraska last year. That's how deeply set in it is in the American psyche, that it is indeed okay to continue to conquer and pillage the land and the Native American peoples on it. Hopefully that answers some of your question tonight, Mr. Thomas, I hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Oh, no, thank you.
And so I'll move forward in the discussion. Just you know, I've just recently, I think just last year, I read a text. It's a book that is called The Half Has Never Been Told, or This Half Has Never Been Told. Fantastic book by author, last name is Baptist. And he talks about the slavery and the making of American capitalism. And it really does a finite job of explaining like the economics behind the driving forces of development that came from enslaved labor. And so as an economist, as a person who used to teach economics and on the high school level, I was drawn to this text, and it made slavery so much more personal, but also it helped me to understand a lot more clearly the true ramifications and application of how banks were set up because of enslavement, how the credit industry was set up because of enslavement, and the stock market was set up because of enslavement. There's all these things, these institutions that are founded in enslavement, and it became personal to me. And so I started thinking about, how do we fix that? How do we repair that? And the economist in me kind of made me intrigued as to how we might be able to create systems that, you know, that reverse these impacts. And so the conversation of reparations has been personal to me in that way. And I'm curious for our other panelists, and I'll start with A'Jamal, Mr. Byndon. For you, sir, I guess I'll start the question and I'll ask all three of our panelists the same thing. How did you come to the topic of reparations, either personally or professionally? And we'll start with A'Jamal.
My first forte into this conversation was on the board of Catholic Charities USA Social Policy Committee, and they had a discussion where they were discussing this with another civil rights group in Washington, D.C., and they asked us to support the concept. Some of you may be aware, this has been a resolution that's been introduced in Congress for probably over 40 years, and so they asked us to talk about it as a social policy committee, which was people from across the country. And for the most part, I would say half of the members of this committee were against it. It was a part of the board. And there was an elderly woman from Florida, African-American, who said basically they asked us just to have the conversation. And as she kind of framed the conversation, we adapted the resolution that said we should be talking about it. Unfortunately, we didn't do much with it as an organization with that, but it became my first forte into that. The second forte was my experience being in Southern Africa and seeing what happened in that part of the world when there was a form of redistribution of land, as well as Zimbabwe. And then the other issue became my understanding of the history of the United States, of slavery, and being familiar with Malcolm X when he talked about we work from sun up to sundown and then get a cent. And as I started to study the disparities of race in terms of our country between African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans, I came to see that we have a situation where people have reaped millions of billions of dollars, zillions of dollars, we would say, off a tragedy or a Holocaust for Africans and Native Americans and never paid a penny. So that became my understanding of it. But what was more unfortunate is I found that many people didn't even want to have the conversation. Again, in order to do anything for reparations or even reconciliation or even repairing, you have to have the conversation. And so I've been kind of stuck on the conversation because we have not done that too well in our communities. And I think that's the beginning of the process of dealing with this issue.
Thank you for that. Paul, how about you? Paul Feilmann, if you want to jump in here, how did you come to the topic of reparations, either personally or professionally?
I did mental health counseling with kids and families for 25 years. I raised my own 5 kids. I got 7 grandkids. And then I retired a few years ago and started just being involved in the community, volunteered with a couple of different organizations. I volunteered with all the prisons in the state of Nebraska. And I also volunteered at elementary school. And I just kept seeing a pattern of poverty that I didn't quite understand until I started exploring issues related to this history of slavery and, the Native discrimination against Native population and how it's just built this pattern that makes digging your way out of poverty really, really difficult and paves the way for intergenerational incarceration. Probably the most powerful thing that clued me in on what really is going on with poverty was when I met Durcell Trotter at the premiere of the documentary Out of Omaha. It's an amazing film. It was filmed here in Omaha, followed twin brothers and their younger brother in North Omaha for 8 years. And it showed their life living in poverty, dealing with family members that were incarcerated, had some mental health issues. And it all relates back to the history of North Omaha and the racism and the history that kept them from ever being able to have the same opportunities that other folks have. And 2 of the brothers got out of that with some help, but the 3rd brother ended up being incarcerated. But the pattern, and actually when I look at the whole concept of reparations, I was looking at another concept. When you look at the history of slavery, as you were just talking about, I think of the term restitution as opposed to, reparations. And I looked up restitution in the dictionary when I'm looking at slavery and the history of racism in the United States. And this is the definition of restitution: the restoration of something lost or stolen to its proper owner and recompense for injury or loss. And I think building, helping people that have been impacted by the history of slavery and racism in this country achieve equal financial footing so that children that we know don't have to grow up in this severe poverty, because that's what's really creating a lot of our ills in the community in Omaha in particular. And I really have set out to try and work with other people to build a platform to try and get more awareness of things like that. And that movie really was amazing, really woke me up to what work has to be done.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you sharing. Yeah, and I think there's information in the chat for those looking for some ways to connect with that documentary that was released a couple years back. Yeah, going right back to you then, Colette. How did you come to this topic of reparations?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to tell you, I was born into it without realizing it. Grew up on the Winnebago Indian Reservation, grew up a biracial child. My tribe was a part of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1878. So I have known nothing but land being forcibly ceded or different tribes that's having to migrate and go. And like I grew up among different people than the tribe that I'm enrolled in, which was a beautiful experience. However, migration in my family on my father's side, I've only known conflict over the land. That's all I've ever known my entire life. So then when I became educated, I appreciated the soundtrack, by the way. That took me back to some of my college days or younger years. And then I started learning the academic sides of what had happened to my people or to my family. So then I started to think about what can I do to give back? And I've devoted my career since then to education and paving the way for others. It's not about me, of course. It's about our peoples, the people, I would say. And then I also started to learn about how other groups, African American, Afro Indigenous, I hope we talk about that some tonight, or Latinx, back then it would have been Hispanic, or whatever labels the government was throwing on us. Then I really got keyed into how this was so systematic across the board, and which fueled my fire, of course, even further so. I share all that to say that with many of us who have come to this work, I believe we were called for probably reasons more than just coincidence. I believe that we were called into it to affect change, or to at least assist the next ones, the future, in doing so. So that was an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so, you know, Colette, you just spoke to the fact that we already have in a small way, and maybe not the full bore of what could be done, but the country's already looked to address reparations in other situations. Again, maybe not to the respect or the extension that it needs to right a wrong completely, but it's not this unfamiliar, this impossible thing that people make reparations out to be. And so I guess the next question for all of you is really, when it comes down to it, you know, our country, this nation, has a history of reparations. And we just, how do we get people to understand a little bit more about examples of history throughout history of our country positioning itself to repair situations, to make right of wrongs? And I'll throw it to Paul first. What throughout history should people be aware of as far as what our country actually making reparations before?
Well, my dad was Jewish, grew up in Germany, and they had to leave in '39 because of Hitler. And he had to leave. My grandfather had to leave his company. He had a clothing wholesale company in Germany. And he didn't think that they would take that from him because he was in World War I and was an honored veteran there, but they did take it from him. And after he came to the United States, he ended up actually fighting against Germany in World War II, got a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, but he ended up getting reparations from the German government that helped pay for my grandmother's nursing home care, and that was just an example of reparations historically that have been provided. I know there's other examples of that, but my focus really on how to make reparations now is what would it take to lift all families impacted by the history of racism in the United States out of poverty. And I think focusing on the fact that a lot of folks did not have a fair start, and they need a lot of opportunity to develop ideas that will help them pull themselves out of poverty would be the strongest way that I could see of initiating reparations of some kind. And I'm really focused mostly on Omaha. I think Omaha has got a lot of work that can be done. I was looking at the Kids Count documents that just came out and shows the poverty levels. Nebraska, in as far as the African American population post-COVID, is like 49th or 50th in food insecurity and housing insecurity in the United States. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think the community needs to come together to work on how to do that. But folks mostly impacted is the Black community. They need to really drive the process. What do they need to overcome the barriers that the white community historically in the last 100 years in Omaha has put in front of them?
That's an interesting position to take, and I appreciate that. I want to talk a lot more about what reparations could look like, but I want to give the other panelists an opportunity. I'll go back to you, Colette. is there an example of throughout history of reparations that you want to call upon to kind of make it so it's not this intangible, this impossible, overwhelming task of reparations?
Absolutely. And I think Paul's point is well taken because, first of all, we need to think about the land, especially in our country, in the United States. Land is like gold, so to speak, the real estate. And to think about how some tribes, for example, one that comes to mind, they went from somewheres of 90 million acres down to less than 2 million when it was all said and done. There is land out there. Give the land back. That's very simple. And for my African American relatives and friends and colleagues, when has that promise been made due that we learned about in school, which to your point, Mr. Thomas, makes it seem like this aloof, obscure point over here when it's not. It is very, very much real. Or I think about some of my friends and relatives who would be indigenous, Latinx, Mexican indigenous, whose lands were taken when Texas started ceding lands from them. So this is a very common Japanese internment in our country. We took away that from Japanese families. So there is no marginalized group that is not untouched by this forcible ceding of lands. And why is it such a big deal to ask for that back? It's not, when you think about it. And for Native Americans, it's in our treaties. It is in our treaties. So this is something that was not just made up. My ancestors were very smart in their negotiation. Another way, I wanted to throw this out there, and I have to let everyone, I have to apologize. I have to leave early. I got called in to do work stuff tonight. So, and speaking of, I say tuition. When are we going to start enabling tuition for families of African American families? For example, we were talking about this in a panel I did a couple weeks ago. Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, both had mistresses. They took quote unquote mistresses. African American family members that have been just doubly shamed, when they denied their lineage or whatever. No, we need to stop doing that. We need to start giving back reparations in ways that are clever and that will indeed grow economic prosperity. I work in higher ed. I vote for tuition remission, tuition scholarships. And parks are fine. I love the outdoors, but I want to see tangible investment for generational wealth. Sorry, I took a long time on that.
No, that's great, and I'll toss it to A'Jamal, but I just as you bring that up, I just think about Georgetown. Georgetown University had a history of having started off by purchasing enslaved people that helped them in the sale of those enslaved people to keep their college, to keep their university up and running. And they actually found the ancestors of those enslaved people and granted those individuals scholarships to attend Georgetown University as a form of reparation for the enslavement and the selling of their ancestors. And so A'Jamal, any thoughts of throughout history, why are we making this thing such a big deal if we have examples that we can actually look at to follow, to lead us in having conversations and putting policy decisions together?
Very appreciate that. I had an opportunity to go to Georgetown for a 1-week workshop or seminar or Georgetown project dealing with RED, or racial ethnic disparities. In our first day there, they had one of the administrators or professors give us an overview of why Georgetown is so progressive on this issue. I was very impressed with how they framed it, how they were making amends and talking about it for the descendants of who were enslaved, and even how they use very good language in terms of getting the student body involved in that. I came back to Omaha and forwarded a letter to the president of Creighton and say, hey, can we do this in Omaha? Because always when you go outside the city and you see people do that, you want to bring it back and see if we can have that conversation. One of my concerns or conversation is just even having it. I think one of the issues we can show that when Ta-Nehisi Coates came out with his article in 2014, and it was like the best-selling magazine of Atlantic that in the history of him writing about what happened in our country, I think goes a long ways to us talking about racism and the disparities. And the thing that I think that we have not talked about as much is that you have a 214-year gap between the wealth of what white folks have and what African Americans have. Those are realities. You look at some of the situations that have been inflicted upon us, trauma. You look in terms terms of some of the Jim Crowism. David Bachman wrote a book about akin to slavery. So there are a number of factors that we can do to talk about amends. And again, part of it for some of us is difficult to comprehend that we can even go there, but all you gotta do is think of COVID-19. We sure do know how to produce some money for that. Or we know how to produce money for farmers for not growing their crops and so on. We know about the oil companies when they don't always collect all the oils, they still get a certain amount of revenue from some of that. So there's a notion that we have examples of reparations. And I think we, again, my point I would argue is start the conversation before we even have it, we shouldn't shut down. And at the other point, I think is probably the most important is how do you actualize these conversations to deal with maybe issues that we face locally? Because I think too often in these conversations, we can be very heady and fail to translate it back to the disproportionality of how those generations of people who are impacted by slavery and some of the Jim Crowism and so on. But Georgetown, I think, has set the tone for us as a country on how you can have that conversation in post-secondary education institutions. And maybe we should just pick a leaf or take a notebook from them and use the same concept here in Omaha or in Nebraska, because again, we face some of the same disparities. And again, part of it comes back to those of us acknowledging history, those of us acknowledging other groups from Native Americans, African Americans, or whoever who have suffered. And again, one of the things that I've said when I was teaching Black studies, I refuse to talk about the Holocaust without talking about genocide or enslavement. Those are all historical tragedies that affected a large group of people, and no group in a sense should act as if they have a corner on some of these issues that impacted their group members. But for many African Americans, people want you to move along and forget about it. In the meanwhile, we're still stuck on some of these plantation situations today because we have not cleaned up our past.
So I appreciate that so very much, because you've hit on what reparations could look like. Even when you talked about the farmers, even when you talked about the oil companies, those are things that aren't necessarily reparations, but it's government policy decisions that have an economic impact on large groups of individuals or large industries. And so there's a lot to unpack there. What I would ask, I guess, we have about 5 minutes left before we go into breakouts. And even if Colette is still on, we'll try to make sure we get everybody a chance to kind of go through. And I'm gonna ask you a hard question, okay? I'm gonna ask you a very challenging question. At least it's hard for me. So considering that, banking has its roots in discrimination and racism and enslavement, looking at education, as you pointed out, so many schools and institutions have their roots in some of these same issues. Looking at criminal justice, policing, prisons, all of those things came from enslavement and the mass genocide of Native American tribes, right? Looking at housing, looking at health. I mean, there's incidences of opportunity throughout all of these different institutions, right? So I guess I'm gonna pose this question, and if Colette is on, we'll start with her, because I know she's got a short amount of time. But if we were to pick one, we'll go Colette, then A'Jamal, then Paul to kind of wrap it up. If we could pick one institution that should be a starting point to make immediate reconciliation, like tomorrow, we're going to reconcile this thing and get it fixed in this institution, which institution would we need to start with first?
I got it. Healthcare. We got to get that figured out right away. It's long overdue. I'm a researcher, working as a researcher. The most frustrating thing I hear is when you hear the same ongoing problems. And as African American, Native American, Latinx, Asian American, wherever we're representing, women of color, we do not have to prove anymore the racial inequities or the gaps in healthcare. No, enough's enough. That is the most inhumane system that I've seen. Someone just brought up COVID. I was terrified with the way public health would respond. And they did not shock me in our lack of response. And of course, our former administration, I am going to put that on the record, did not handle that at all. There you go, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yellow Robe. I appreciate you joining us and for the time that you gave us and obviously the insights that you provided as well. So I think I said A'Jamal was up next for this one.
Well, you know me, and I will say this, and some of you may find this surprising, education. I think the education we get as African Americans is brainwashing and idiotic, and so as Bob Marley says, to make us a fool. But I think once you have a good education, you have free education, you're able to earn a living and do things for yourself. And again, I think one of the reasons why people send their kids to Ivy League or prestigious colleges is because they get a good income. And so if we can get education to be in sync, people could take care of themselves. And I think that's one of the ways that you can give it to folks or help people get education. Therefore, they don't have to maybe need any money because they can earn their income. So if somebody's going to come up and hand me $1 and I already got $1, I'm going to be a lot different than someone who didn't have $1. And I think that education can help you to see the stuff that has put us in these quandaries or these quagmires. And the last point I think is probably the most important. We sometimes fail to understand why many of our young kids don't like education. Being an educated Afrocentric person in OPS going through 12 years of school was torture. And I say that very seriously. So I was raised in such a way that I had to see things completely different. Don't get me wrong. I think education is important, but I also think what good is education if you can't translate it? And I think if we can give quality education to people, they can take care of themselves. And I think Malcolm was a classic example. The guy only had a 9th grade education, became one of the greatest leaders from Omaha. And I think if we use his model and we run with that, it will show us how there's this diaspora that we all belong to, challenging our system and making it better. So I would go with education as my #1 issue. And I also believe in free tuition for people in general.
Thank you, A'Jamal. Appreciate that. Paul, what institution are we going with?
Yeah, I think we need to sit down and ask people that live in severe poverty to give us the ideas of what they need to get out of poverty. And we need to address childhood poverty because it's costing our whole community. It's like a cancer in our community. I mean, right now, I testified last week at the Appropriations Committee down in Lincoln because they were hearing a proposal to build $232 million prison. What could be done with the resources like that could be put into preventing childhood poverty, which is the fuel that feeds the prisons, that makes the need for more and more prisons. So this is it's not just reparations for a particular group. You know, a rising tide floats all boats. And getting addressing poverty and asking people to really steer the boat out of poverty and giving them a chance to take direction on that and give us ideas. They did it in Canada really effectively in the last 5 years. And they went around the country and asked people that were affected, indigenous populations, people that were affected by poverty, how can we get you out of poverty? And they've really made a 20% improvement in the poverty level in Canada in the last 5 years. And they're doing some of those things right now. Part of it has to do with the payments to children, because children living in poverty is what fuels the birth to prison pipeline.
There we go. Appreciate that, Paul. And I appreciate all of the contributions that were made from our panelists today. Y'all know I'm a big fan of inclusive communities, and I just recently was reading a book called The Conversation that just came out this past month, and it talks about the need for building human relations, the need for building relationship and having conversations around these difficult topics. And the more that we engage in these conversations, the broader the path towards justice, towards reconciliation, toward reparation becomes. And so thank you to the inclusive communities for this opportunity to moderate. I will toss it back to Colin so we can get into what people are really looking forward to, which is a chance to kind of share their thoughts on what they heard in these breakout rooms. So Colin, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Barry. I appreciate it. Dominic, did you have anything to add before I went into the
go for it.
Perfect, cool. So we just have a couple, like we do virtual agreements, just a couple of OTT breakout room agreements here. I think I fixed my timing, so it won't time out on me here. But these are just a couple of things in order to create a space in these breakout rooms where we can have constructive dialogue. The first one just being one mouth, one mic, which just really means proper turn taking, right? Giving folks a chance to finalize their thoughts and statements. We always say the Vegas twist, not quite the Vegas rule, meaning, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, because we hope that things that happen here can leave and impact you in the ways in which you transform into our world, into our society. So the stories stay, but the lessons leave. This notion of making space and taking space, keep an open mind, and then just generally conducting yourself in a respectful manner with your fellow community members here. And with that, Molly is going to be putting us into these breakout rooms. There's nothing that you have to do other than let the session time out. I will do a reminder here for facilitators in breakout rooms that we are going to do a share out portion after this. So sometimes it's helpful to elect the person that you want to be your representative towards the beginning, so that person can kind of prepare by the end. But Dominic, is there anything you wanted to add there at all?
I was just going to also add I statements, if you want to go over I statements.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, we always say I statements. This just starting your sentences and your thoughts in these dialogues with I think, I believe, instead of using generalizations or looping people into your statement by saying like, you all know what I mean when I say this, right? This just helps us take accountability for our own narrative, for our own stories and our lived experiences. That's always a good rule to follow as well.
As we had this conversation about reparations, the template is, I think, pretty, I shouldn't say easy to recognize, but there's an existing, specifically with African Americans, of what should be done to right a wrong in regards to slavery. And you need to just look at what happened during Reconstruction for that time that it existed. The policies, the practices, the programs that were put in place from 1865 to 1877 that Black people actually gained political and economic and social values. The state was used to protect Black folks as opposed to incriminating Black folks. I mean, there's an easy bar of what could and should be done with this conversation. And as a great example of how to go back and study that particular period to see what should and could be put back into place that was taken away. Today being his birthday, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a book about Reconstruction that does an excellent job of really, really, really going deep. I'm talking like I'm listening to it on Audible and it's like 12 hours of listening. And so it's intimidating, but it's right there for all of us to really examine. And oftentimes we try to reinvent the wheel when it comes to policies and things like that. But I honestly think that if we just look at what our ancestors have done, there's plenty of work that has been established for us to just model off of and just actually make it like come to fruition this time instead of like taking it away after some of it worked.
And you said the book is called Reconstruction, or
yeah, it's called. I get the exact title.
I got it. I'll share it out, and we can probably, since we're recording this, Barry, we can just keep that part in.
I forgot that we're recording.
Yeah, and I always send out an email. Yeah, we didn't. I didn't. I knew I would forget to unpause, so I'm just listening to myself today. I always send out an email the day after with all the resources that were shared and the link to the video. So I will definitely put in the book.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm gonna raise a different point, and it goes back to Barry, maybe this issue with the Department of Education and linking the curriculum and OPS and elsewhere, because one of the things that I find somewhat painful in Nebraska is that you have to come to a table talk or to these events to get this conversation when we should have it as part of our curriculum. And so again, even though you have a law that they've said that police officers have to get diversity training, you shouldn't have to have a law. I mean, my point is, how do we take this conversation and make it almost organic so that people like you or me, whoever else, shouldn't have to always advocate to say, let's study our history and let's look at some issues, how we can do the rights and wrongs. But part of what I'm trying to say more than anything is, how do you get people just organically to have the conversations, and hopefully they'll figure out what to do next? Because I think as I was listening to, and it's been the challenge of table talk over the years and other conversations, what do you do with it? Is it a public policy conversation? Is it a county board conversation? Is it an education conversation? It's probably all of the above, but you want people organically to do this so that you don't have to have people who's advocating legislation for stuff that we would just do as normal, good people, and just use history as example. So Barry, my point would be, is it squeezed worth the juice? What is this about? And that's what I was asking Dominique about a little bit, is when you get finished, how do you get people to say, I want more, or I want to do something about it? Because I think so often those us as professionals, we sometimes leave things on the table when we should be working with more people and doing a warm handoff to do these things like this.
Sure. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you all had some good conversations, and we're excited to hear what all you talked about. So in as about of a minute as possible, because we do have several rooms tonight, we're going to go through each of the rooms, and if somebody can be the designated share out person. So from room 1, this was the room with Colin as the facilitator. And if there is somebody from that room that would like to share out.
Yes, I failed to adhere from my own advice of assigning people before we broke out. And so anyone else from my group that wants to jump in, please feel free to do so. But I think we really, we had a great discussion. I think we really just focused in on Omaha, obviously, specifically, and how we as a community, like A'Jamal was talking about, we haven't even sat down to have the conversation and like talking about things of where to start. Like, I mean, everyone always talks about talking to talk, but we're not even talking to talk. So I think we just need to at least start there. We also ended on in terms of like action items, looking to the mayoral race. So we don't have people in power that know how to talk about these issues. So if we can get people that represent this conversation, that represent the communities that we're talking about in positions of power to use that platform, that would be a good way to move forward as well.
Dominic, you're on mute.
Thank you. Moving on to room 2. Our facilitator in room 2 is Denise. So anybody in Denise's group that would like to share out?
Well, much of our conversation took place around system change and how it's affected, whether we look at a federal issue or whether we look at individual persuasions. And I don't know that we resolved the best way to go. We raised a number of issues that exist in Omaha, from gentrification to, I didn't get to say it, but a big issue for me in North Omaha, if we want to affect North Omaha, is if we don't take care of the sewer system over there, nobody's going to invest. And so we just didn't have enough time.
Thank you, Craig, for sharing out for room 2. Okay, moving on. So in room 3, we had our facilitator was Lachelle. Anybody in Lachelle's group that would like to share out and some action items that you talked about?
So I did take notes. I offered, nobody took the bait. But we had a great discussion, and I second that it was too short. But some common themes that came up was just that it's good that we're talking about it, and that one of the problems has been a refusal to even start the discussion or to acknowledge things. And we kind of talked about how that probably comes from a place of like fear and being scared of what it means to actually have to acknowledge how you or your family may have benefited, from other people's free labor and what that looks like. But everybody's really excited about the fact that we are having this conversation in Omaha, and there was a lot of positivity and looking towards the future and hoping that there can be some more concrete actions taken by the government.
Thanks, Lachelle. So we're going to move on to room 4. I'm not sure who the facilitator in room 4 was. It had Damien, Jennifer, Jill, Lisa, Susie, Tamika, and Tony in this room. Who would like to share out?
Mandy Kubicek was our moderator, and she wasn't feeling well. And so she might have gotten off. But the people in group 4 were amazing. And so I just took notes, and I'd like to share their ideas and what they had to say. First of all, the systems have been broken for way too long, and they were wondering, how can we collectively grow our powers into reality? What are the next steps to fix broken systems? How do we build the case for change? A couple talked about reparations, how they came to the meeting thinking one way about reparations and hadn't thought about different examples like healthcare, scholarships for college and career. It's not just a check, one of them said. How to bridge the gaps and create access to opportunities. Talk about difficult conversations near the end. How do you talk and have those difficult conversations? And they talked about starting with facts and finding common ground and being an advocate, wondering how do we frame those tough conversations so they move to action moving forward and finding that common ground. So I really appreciated being in group 4.
Thanks, Lisa. So in group 5, our moderator was Maxwell. Maxwell, are you going to share out, or is somebody else from the group sharing out?
I can do a little share out. So for our group, I feel like we started our conversation off with just what it meant to be ready for these reparations, and like kind of where, kind of like the headspace that the United States had to be in. And then it kind of shifted towards more of the things that really would make a big difference, and how not focusing on one institution, but kind of like developing a mixture of all of the institutions, kind of like education and the youth, and kind of mixing that together. And then with the prison system and the healthcare system, like kind of mixing them all together, which was kind of nice. And then, yeah, again, I got a third. It was a little short. I felt like it was still progressing so well. And then we didn't really hit the conclusion of the discussion, but it was a lot of lessons and perspectives that were given that were extremely valuable.
All right, thanks, Maxwell. So in group 6, this was the group facilitated by, excuse me if I say your name incorrectly, Renan?
It's Rhiannon.
Rhiannon?
Yes.
And so who are you going to share out for your group?
No, we have Tracy's going to do that for us.
Okay, great.
Hi. So our group, sorry, my husband's leaving the room. He's echoing. We started off with the book recommendation of Caste. And then we started talking about, there were a couple people that were nonprofit groups in our group that talked about philanthropy and maybe the need to change how philanthropy is used, which I thought was an interesting perspective. And then we moved on into talking about how, as white people, the defensiveness of white people on this topic of reparations, and even defensiveness within our own families and in our friend groups. That there's this idea that we weren't slave owners, we didn't cause the problems, so why should we have to fix them? But then also talking about how it may have been our forefathers that caused this. They're the ones that are guilty for it. However, we need to fix it. So down the road. And then also this idea of, Americans, culturally speaking, very individualized thinkers, thinking of the individual versus thinking of ourselves collectively as a human race and wanting to support us collectively. And then we kind of moved into talking a little bit about the distorted history, blaming, and needing a better, more comprehensive history, the truth, the facts that we can share and grow and help repair. I hope I did our group justice.
Thanks, Tracy. So from room 7, we had Amy, Haley, Judith, Mary, Barton, Maureen, and Nicole and Toya. Who would like to share out from group 7?
This is Amy. I agreed to speak up. So I'm gonna kind of tag on to what Tracy said before I kind of reverse to where we started. But we also talked about the defensiveness of white people and how how is it my problem when I wasn't the one who owned the slaves, right? And we talked about one way to try and combat that is, of course, education, is making sure that everyone is educated about why there are still problems, why we still have this huge gap between white and people of color and the wealth and their education, and also using education, of course, to combat that in general. And something that we can do ourselves besides being advocates is reaching out to our legislators. So staying on top of what's happening in our government and actually reaching out to them and telling them what we want to happen, not just being passive forces and casting your ballot once every couple of years and forgetting about them in between. Something really interesting, though, that was brought up is we have somebody currently in Texas that joined us, and she talked about how in Dallas-Fort Worth there is a sort of reparation program or education program available to children in poverty, and it's called Early College High School. And the local government there picks up the tab for these children or these young adults to get a diploma simultaneously with their high school diploma. So they can get some sort of degree while they're going through high school. So they have that education already under their belt. So I think that probably takes away some of the reasons that some people don't go to university, is maybe their family hasn't gone. And so why do I need to do this? Or they feel like they need to get immediately into the workforce to help their family. So I think that's a great idea. And we both, and as she mentioned, she's like, this is in Dallas. How did they do this? And you know, we're not doing this. I thought that was really interesting. And we also had a woman in our group who family has owned some land, and she is trying to figure out what the best way is, because it is, of course, originally Native American land. What she should do with it, possibly reparations. So she's trying to work through that. It seems like a pretty difficult, something pretty difficult to go through. Yeah, so I think, you know, those are kind of the things that we discussed that haven't already been said.
Thanks, Amy, for sharing. In room 8, this is the room that was facilitated by Kyle. Who would like to share out in this room?
My group, we decided, we voted me to share out. I also want to say thanks to group 8, making my first table talk experience a great one. I didn't get to say that in the group, ran out of time, but we've really felt like a family, One point that I also want to apologize if I only wrote like keywords and kind of who said it, and if I mess up what you said, I'm sorry. But one good point I thought we started a conversation with was Katie bringing up, like, with having like reparations, the most common thing is land. And another way you can think about it is giving people homes and having homes. Like, that's really important as well. And what my spin on it too is, if you have land, what if you have like your reparations giving you land, but it's 100 miles away, when you have so much set up here? Giving a home could be something that could a good stepping stone for anybody. Home ownership, I feel like, is a big deal in this country as well. And another point was admitting fault, and that's where reparations kind of start, is basically like the people in charge admitting that they were wrong and doing whatever they did, and then kind of not necessarily making up for it, but doing something about it at least. Which is, I think, a problem in our government, is that they don't like to admit fault in a lot of situations. Another thing is, kind of piggybacking off that too, is like the difference between reparations and then reparations, where what government lists as reparations, when in reality they could have done way more, and they kind of just ignore the problems that are at hand. And then Scott said something too, with a lot of times reparations have to start with the people, because without the people and making these problems known and widespread to everybody, the government it's going to be very easy for the government to just ignore the situations and act like not happening. So the more people speaking out about it, the better. Then one point that I brought up is like something that could be changed or adjusted with education, with reparations, with education, is how the school systems, the public school systems, are funded off property tax, and how that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in a lot of situations. And yeah, we also had a discussion before it got cut off about the census and everything, and how making, I also want to say, like, I didn't get to share my opinion on it, but with like programs that could have like certain individuals pay like a certain tax that could go to a fund for people that, as like a reparation, to have them get access to like homes and stuff. And another thing was we didn't have any ideas on, or at least certain people that have ideas of like how you would get around that or do that. And I think it's also important to realize that like it's not necessarily our job to have a set in stone plan that could be passed with the government and everything. There's people that actually get paid to do that as well, but it's our job to at least bring up the ideas and everything.
Thanks, Hal, and thanks, Group 8. In room 9, this was facilitated by Christy. Were you the facilitator in room 9?
Yeah, it was me.
Okay.
And then we got into the discussion before I remembered that I needed to ask somebody to do the share out, so it ended up being me. But we were having a good discussion. We were talking about how important it is to have these discussions, because the starting point a lot of the time is that nobody wants to have this conversation, and it needs to start somewhere. So that was good. And then we also talked a bit about how everyone needs to be involved in the conversation. So it can't just be that BIPOC people are talking about it. It has to be that white people are involved in the conversation as well, because everyone has to work together to create reparations that work and that serve the populations that they're intended to serve. So I think that was an important point that came out. And then we talked about what those could look like. So we did talk about some examples of reparations, like the ones that were given about Georgetown University and a couple others. And then Allison in our group says that her church has something called Beloved Conversations, and they're conversations about racism in the context of faith. And so when they're selling tickets for these conversations, they have like a payment scale that is meant to address that idea. And I'm gonna share a link. She shared it higher up, but the chat has gone quite a bit. So if you click that link, you can kind of see some of the language that they've used. So that was quite interesting. And then we also talked about how reparations can't be one thing. It has to look like many things, because if it's like you decide that reparations will be in education and you give free education, not everybody is going to choose to go to college. So it has to be that reparations come in many forms in a way that elevates the population. So I think I got it all.
Awesome. Thanks, Christy. And we're our last group tonight, room 10. This was facilitated by Tina. And who in this group would like to share out?
So I was nominated or voluntold to share out. Yeah, I would like some reparations for this, obviously. So we talked a little bit at the beginning just about kind of our framework and what resonated with us from the panel discussion. And I had shared that Colette saying that tangible efforts toward generational wealth really stuck with me, because I was really thinking about just the labor and the stolen land and the generational head start that many majority culture people have gotten. We also had a conversation about discomfort with terminology, and how when people hear things like the word reparations, or when people hear the concept of defunding the police, it makes people nervous. or they have an automatic reaction to the wording. And so how there needs to be kind of a breakdown of the language and some common language shared, and then an increase in dialogue among people about these topics. We talked about different ways to institute reparations, and a lot of our discussion centered around making more equitable access to medical treatment and education, things like that. We talked a lot about the banking system and things we didn't really know about the history of reparations. And we also shared some resources like the 1619 Project and podcast.
Awesome, thank you all. And we had some large groups tonight. So thank you all for sharing out. That's some great conversations that were had. Before we share out our evaluations, I just want to toss it to A'Jamal and Paul. What are some last thoughts that you would like to leave us with on how we can go out in our communities and get more involved in these conversations and be better advocates?
You know, I would start off by saying we have to increase these conversations. It's like the process. How many magic wands can we have? If again we get another wish, how do you increase the intensity of these conversations throughout the community? And I think Chantel said something very well where, you know, we got to learn how to demystify the language so that people don't shut down, and understanding contextually how we as a village or as a community or society were impacted by many groups or people who are suffering. So the fact that we have to get our educational institutions to have these conversations, our faith-based organizations, and people in general, because as I've said so many times, Omaha is a perfect microcosm of the United States in terms of racial makeup, but yet we live in a divided apartheid city. And how do we acknowledge those histories before us and bring people together? As I say, we oftentimes come together in some of these situations, but how do we make a little bit more of a long term? But really appreciative of folks participating in this conversation, because I think what it does is says that there's a thirst in this community for us to do more of these things. And I really think folks have shared a great deal tonight.
Thanks, A'Jamal. And Paul, any last? You're on mute.
I really encourage people to see the movie Out of Omaha. It's on Amazon Prime and it's on YouTube. It will give you the clearest picture of the effect of our history of segregation and racism on poverty and children's lives in the community, and the birth to prison pipeline, and get people to share that with other people. Really, the definition of a healthy community is the number of children living in severe poverty and the number of people being incarcerated. And reparations would basically address all of that. And if you want to know if our community is getting healthier, whether we're repairing those damages, you look at those numbers. And if they're going down, we're making progress. If they're not, the whole community's getting unhealthy.
Thanks, Paul. And I see Lena has her hand up. Pam, are you able to translate for us?
I have to find her. Hang on a second. I found her. Okay. I know that we were recently speaking specifically about North Omaha and the poverty area, but it's interesting how we talk about the poverty and the statistics here, but likewise we have so many philanthropic efforts that take place. And what I would say to you is that Omaha is probably, if not number one, up in the top in regards to philanthropic efforts here. I come from New York, and I can tell you that we do not see such an effort that happens there. So we have organizations and people here that are highly charitable, but we only see this in situational opportunities such as Christmas and things of that nature. And so, for example, me being as a Jewish woman, that is not something that I can take advantage of, yet and still we have these opportunities out here. we have the Tri-Faith Initiative here, which is a fantastic organization. And that is something that we alone here in Omaha, Nebraska have, and other communities don't have that. So I think what we have is we have an opportunity to create something because of what we already have here in Omaha. Oftentimes people come to Omaha and they think we're lacking. So I think in the reality is we have so much, we just need to put more efforts to those things, such as museums, educational opportunities, which bring us together. And I think that gives us a visualization and an understanding of what it is that we do have to offer. But again, we need to take advantage of the philanthropic options that we have. I think it's amazing to me how people still view us as very rural and very outdated. And here we have really statistically, our crime levels are very, very low. This is a great place to live. This is a fantastic place to raise kids. We just need to figure out how we can make this a better community for everyone.
Thank you, Lena, for that. I could not agree more. Well, we are out of time and we ran over a little bit. So Molly is going to share in the chat our link to our evaluations. We know that there's always the hunger for more time in these conversations, but we do encourage you to have more conversations with your friends and family in your communities. We will also be having more conversations as we continue this work. Next month, we'll be having our Queer Table Talk on March 30th, talking about trans awareness and celebrating Trans Day of Visibility. And so we encourage you to sign up for that conversation as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you next time.
Hey, everybody.